The other big story this morning, the government is set to give Rwanda around another 15 million quid to secure an immigration treaty.
Remember, we've already given £140 million of taxpayers' money. The Home Secretary, James Cleverly, will soon fly to Kigali to seal the deal. So Chris Hope is our political editor, and he can tell us more. Chris.
That's right. That number is contested by the Home Office today. They say the £15 million to sign this Rwanda treaty is not requested nor being offered. But there's no question more money is probably set aside. We know that £140 million is up until the start of this financial year. More money will probably have gone towards Rwanda this year. What's happening here is the government's got to reassure courts that if illegally arrived migrants go back to Rwanda and have their right to stay processed there, they can't be sent back to the country they were fleeing from. That would be against their human rights. And that's why this money, there may be that we have UK lawyers in courts in Rwanda to make that happen. But it's a massive week, Andrew and Bev, this week for the PM's pledge to stop the boats. Don't forget, that's on one of his main slogans this year. It hasn't happened. He's been frustrated by the Supreme Court. We are probably going to hear more from them on the treaty. First of all, the treaty with Rwanda, and secondly, a new law to disapply human rights from those being sent back to Rwanda, to stop lefty lawyers, to quote what the government says, or some ministers have said, stopping migrants being taken back to Rwanda if they arrive here, to try and break this model. The whole idea is to try and break the business model, to stop migrants coming across that dangerous crossing across the south coast of England and stop them coming here. That's the idea. We'll see a lot more this week on this.
All right, that's Chris Hope. Joining us now is Sir Bob Neill, who's chairman of the House of Commons Justice Select Committee. Sir Bob, morning to you. It's all very well the Prime Minister's taking stuff into the House of Commons, but how's he going to get it past the Supreme Court?
Well, by making sure that we comply with the law. And the Supreme Court's judgment, actually, I think, was perfectly reasonable on the law and the facts. What the Supreme Court said was, in principle, yes, you can do this. They didn't find it was unlawful to process asylum applications offshore. What they said was, on the evidence we've currently got, which actually dated back to September 21, that Rwanda was a safe country. And they set out, I think, about 5 or 6 specific areas that raised concern with them on that. Now, I think what they're doing, what the government's working on at the moment, are specific ways of actually addressing precisely those deficiencies that the Supreme Court found. So we can say, people will be properly processed out there. They will have due process. It will be safe. That's a sensible way forward in my mind.
And your colleague Mark Francois was with us just a moment ago, Sir Bob, saying that the government has to ensure they have a notwithstanding element to it, notwithstanding the European Court on this specific issue, just as we did with prisoners' votes, exclude them from any deliberation on the issue of Rwanda. Would you support that?
Not in that form, but I think there is a way which we could make it work. There's a rather more important difference, actually, Andrew, that needs to be drawn. This is not, in fact, significantly like the prisoner voting case. The prisoner voting case was a pretty small area where the UK didn't actually derogate from the European Convention on Human Rights or from the judgment of the court. It simply said we are not going to enforce this because we put it to the House of Commons, and the House of Commons rejected the idea of blanket prisoner voting. In fact, after a little bit of toing and froing, there was a compromise and a deal was done and it went away. Now, this is a situation of a different magnitude, obviously, because stopping the boats is really important. I think there are ways in which you can restrict the abuse of appeals, which has sometimes happened. And, for example, it is perfectly possible to look, once we've got all the ducks in a row factually, to say you can't be challenging a decision of Parliament that the process shouldn't be run in a repeat manner. But what you can't do, realistically, Andrew, is legislate. Parliament can say day is night, but it doesn't alter what you see outside the window. So the key thing to do is actually get the facts right on the ground so we actually can get people.
Bob, it seems like Rishi Sunak has basically placed all his chips on the Rwanda plan, and indeed in Suella Braverman's resignation letter, she said that there was no plan B. She didn't resign, did she? Didn't she get the push?
Yeah.
In her goodbye letter, thanks for sacking me letter, she basically said, we don't have a plan B. You've got everything is staked on Rwanda. Do you still think that's the right way to go? So Keir Starmer's been making a bit of noise about the fact that he would prefer to clamp down on the human trafficking gangs.
I don't think there's one single silver bullet in this, actually. And I think James cleverly got that right when he said you shouldn't think that Rwanda, I think his phrase was the be-all and end-all. I think I'd say is you've got to have more than one tool in the box to deal with this. What has been pretty successful has been the deal that we did bilaterally with Albania on return agreements. Clever is working on more of those. I'd certainly encourage that. I certainly think, too, there is merit in working with our opposite numbers over the other side of the channel on the gangs. I think actually don't always agree with Keir Starmer, but there's sense to be pursued in that. I think the other thing that we're not doing anything like enough of is speeding up the processing of people when they get here. Because the system is being spun out. So what I suggest we do, and I've said this before, is we need to be getting more people in the Home Office Investigations Department looking at this. Let's use some retired police officers, others with investigative powers to beef up the Home Office capability. Let's then put some money into getting trained up part-time immigration tribunal judges who can also then be processing the cases. Our committee, went to the Immigration Appeal Tribunal at Hatton Cross. One of the frustrations there the judges have was, time and time again, the case comes up and the Home Office aren't ready. They haven't got their files together. So let's crack that stuff, the actual practical day-to-day procedural things as well.
Well, can we ask you, Sir Bob, on the front page of the Daily Mail, the front page of the Daily Telegraph, the Prime Minister says the BBC must not raise the licence fee. Biggest increase for 40 years, 9%, taking it up to £173.30. He's right, isn't he? It's a cost of living crisis. That's going to hit particularly people on fixed incomes like pensioners pretty hard.
It's a lot for people, and I think we've got to be sensible about this. I'm not one of those who says defund the BBC, but equally, given not everybody uses it, I don't think we should be raising the licence fee at a level that's really going to hit, as you rightly say, some of the poorest, the hardest. So I'm rather with the Prime Minister on this one. The other thing I'd do is I would, wearing my Justice Committee hat, I wouldn't continue prosecuting for people in the magistrates' courts if they don't pay their licence fee. That clogs up the magistrates' court. I'd make that a civil debt, and the BBC can then pursue that through civil processes rather than using the court system to collect it from people sometimes who are in a mess. Those are two sensible things I would do.
Interesting. Bob, there's all of this gossip about whether Nigel Farage is going to come out of the jungle. I don't know whether you're watching I'm a Celebrity, but is he going to come out of the jungle?
I was washing my hair that night.
Well, is he going to come out of the jungle and join the Conservative Party? Stanley Johnson in this very studio last week said that he thought he would before the next election.
Well, Stanley's a character. I wouldn't always go to him for political advice, so bless him.
But he knows what's going on. He's got his ear to the ground, though, when it comes to the Tory party.
Well, sometimes not, I think, actually, Beth. Stanley has his own take on these things. Nigel Farage stood against me in the by-election in 2006. He was a vile opponent, thoroughly unpleasant, and he was thoroughly unpleasant in his dealings with previous Conservative candidates who he stood against as well. Ask my friend Craig McKinley, some of the nasty stuff Nigel said there. I think we've got better people who can get into the Conservative Party than Nigel Farage.
All right, well, that's above me.
Thanks for your honesty, Bob. I love that.
We have to make the point that Nigel's not here to defend himself against those allegations of being vile.
And Bob, if you want to vote for him to stay in the jungle, there's a little app.
I think he might not be. Don't forget, we'd like to know your thoughts about the licence fee. You're happy to pay a little bit more, do we, most? Now, we're going to talk to David Hay, the human rights lawyer, about Rwanda. David, what is this 15... Now, the Home Office are disputing the 15 million, but it seems like more millions to go to Rwanda. Is that going to make the case for them to take refugees watertight, in your view?
No, I mean, good morning to you both. I mean, first of all, why are we spending more money on something that so far hasn't worked? You would have thought if they put the plan in place properly in the first place, that whatever they're now being charged for would have been done then. But I don't think, if we look back, Andrew, it was about exactly a year ago, I think, that the High Court approved this plan, as it were. We're a year later. So even if the government puts this treaty in place, does what the Supreme Court has said they're going to do, if we look at how long it took the last case to go through the process, unless the government try and do shortcuts, even if it's all fine, as I've said many times before, I still don't see anybody going there in this government's term.
What will that £15 million be spent on, David?
Well, if we look at what the Supreme Court has said, they said one of the things they said needed to be done, as your previous guest mentioned, who seems remarkably sensible in everything he said. So why the government can't hire him, I'm not sure. But one of the things that needed to be done is a treaty at the moment instead of a memorandum. So a treaty between the two countries would allow the individual asylum seekers to rely on that in court. And so the government said that's one of the things they're going to do, as well as other things. But even if they do those things, well, let's assume that they then go back to the asylum seekers and say, we're going to deport you. Then the new court process starts. I don't see how that will happen in the time left of this government.
Are you clear, Andrew, on what that... No, I'm not. I'm sorry, David. I don't mind asking the stupid questions. I'm still not clear as to what we're paying our 15 million quid for. Because if we think back to why this got rejected by the Supreme Court, they didn't have faith that the Rwandan authorities would fulfil the non-refoulement process. In other words, they might see somebody stood there asking to stay in Rwanda, and they would say, no, you've got to go back to Eritrea. Now, when they go back to Eritrea, they might get beaten up for being gay. Let's use that as an example. How will this 15 million quid change the mind of the person in the court who's making the wrong judgment in the eyes of the Supreme Court here?
So one of the things, I mean, there may be other things, but one of the things focused on that they said that at the moment with the Supreme Court, there was a memorandum. So there was basically a memo between the UK government and the Rwandan government saying, we will do X, Y, and Z. We will follow policies and procedures. We won't do this.
Right.
The Supreme Court found that isn't safeguarding asylum seekers, because if you're an asylum seeker and you do get sent back, or you're about to and there's a risk, you can't rely on a memorandum between governments. You need a treaty, a law that you can say this is going to be breached. So what will happen is that there will be a treaty, which is an international instrument between the UK and Rwanda, effectively probably saying somewhat similar to what the memorandum said, but in treaty language. That would mean that if that was breached or likely to breach, the individual asylum seeker can rely on that in a court process. That's one of the things they're going to do. And there were other things that they mentioned in terms of the actual process on the ground that needed strengthening. But again, why wasn't that done in the first place? That's one of the things here. We shouldn't be sending any more money as far as I'm concerned. All these things should have been done. And in any event, as I've said, even if all of that is done, looking at the timetable, look back to exactly a year ago when the High Court said, it's okay, you can send them. A year later, the Supreme Court saying, no, you can't. We're still here.
Yeah.
All right. That's David Hay.
We've just...
Fascinating.
Thank you,
Human rights
David.
lawyer.